This project has gone for 2 years, funded by Hort Innovation and also Plant and Food Research with grower support. And the key aim is to answer some of the outstanding questions around pollination that are still out there. The scientific information is really still quite patchy. So this pamphlet that we produced it's with Plant Health Australia is aimed at growers and transferring the information that we found to make them more proactive around pollination. So it includes information around the floral biology, how to get cross-pollination happening by including multiple varieties in their orchards. It also includes information about how nut sets increased in racemes when you cross-pollinate different varieties with other different varieties. We also talk about insect pollinators, and that you have to be really proactive in going out and seeing that you've got them and that they're well distributed in your orchard. The other aspects that we talk about are some of the key pollinators that you can manage. Honeybees and stingless bees are manageable, so if you're lacking pollinators, you can place them where you need in the orchard and potentially boost pollination that way. The aim of this, the information here, is to be continually monitoring your pollinators. So if you've got issues one year, you'll identify those issues, and therefore you can make changes the following year based on the information that you collect year to year. The other aspect is there's other pollinators that growers should be aware of. Particularly certain beetle species can be really useful pollinators. They tend to move more randomly between trees, which make them good at cross-pollinating. But one of the downsides is that applying pesticides, even in the evening, can affect them because they often shelter in trees. Finally, it's just a checklist that growers can follow to make sure that they're meeting all of those things that they're doing to monitor and to try and improve pollination. So they can do that year to year and boost pollination that way. In many cases, particularly in the past, growers grew just one cultivar orchards, but that doesn't promote cross-pollination because there's no other trees that cross-pollen can move across. So they really can only self-pollinate. Some varieties produce nuts through self-pollination, but to get cross-pollination has been demonstrated can have a positive effect on nut sets and nut yields. So by mixing your cultivars, particularly certain varieties, together, you can get good outcomes so long as you've got your pollinators right as far as transferring the pollen. Macadamia essentially has very similar, it's got a lot of similarities to a normal flower. It's got anthers and stamens and a stigma that's on top of the style, but it does something unusual in that before it opens, the anthers will release its pollen, and it will actually be placed around the stigmatic area. So other flowers don't typically do that. They release their pollen on the anthers, and it has implications for pollination. So if insects visit the stigmatic area to collect pollen, then they'll interact with the stigma as well. So if they're going along collecting pollen, they're moving pollen from flower to flower, which increases pollination. If they're feeding on nectar and they're a small insect, they're less likely to interact with that area, so will be less efficient pollinators. But other animals can potentially pollinate. So Macadamia is part of the Proteaceae family, and that's really known as a key bird pollinating family of plants. And the structure of the flower sort of meets a bird pollination because they'll feed on the nectar, they'll rub against the stigmatic area and collect pollen and then move on. So birds can potentially play a key role as well, but a mix of birds and insects. Birds aren't as controllable as insects, so that's one of the key issues. So at the moment, the only reliable, manageable pollinators that we've got are honeybees and stingless bees. One of the things is that a lot of growers, if they're planning their orchard, they rely on information around cross-pollination. They don't realise that it's really quite easy to do themselves. So all you need to do is collect pollen. You can just use a piece of plastic that's transparent so you can see that you're rubbing pollen from one cultivar that you want to test and on the nut set of the other, and you take it to another raceme and you apply it, and you compare the nut set with an equivalent raceme on the tree, and that gives you an idea of, okay, these cultivars are going to work in my area, and so that's a really good way to be able to identify which one's going to work. So one thing that's often unavoidable in certain times for growers is the use of pesticides. They may have a big outbreak of a pest species that will threaten the crop. Trying to choose pesticides that are less toxic to bees is important. The application in the evening when the bees aren't active is another good step to protect bee pollinators. But one of the downsides is that if you've got wild non-bee pollinators, they often shelter in the crop at night, and so they're still going to be directly impacted by those pesticide applications.